Sign
She
these
thought she was
papers.
living
It's
her
over.
dream until the truth turned it into a nightmare. Everything seemed perfect.
How can you be
Love,
so
trust,
cruel?
a future carefully built piece by piece. But behind the calm surface, deception was growing, waiting for the right moment to break through. And when it finally does, it shatters everything she believed in.
Congratulations, we've
Yet in
finalized
that
the
moment of
adoption
pain,
papers.
something powerful is born. Because she refuses to stay broken. She rises, stronger, fearless, and ready to take back control of her life. What was meant to destroy her becomes the very thing that makes her unstoppable. The lesson? Sometimes life reveals the truth in the most painful ways, but that truth sets you free. Strength isn't about avoiding the fall, it's about how you rise after. And the moment you choose yourself, you take your power back. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and support the channel. Your support is the biggest motivation for us to continue creating more powerful stories like this. Thanks for watching.
Julian waited for the precise moment of maximum devastation. His wife, Eleanor, 7 months pregnant and dressed in black, was accepting condolences at the reception following her father's funeral. With tears still wet on her cheeks, he steered her into the quiet study, away from the sympathetic eyes of family and friends. It was there he slid a tablet across the antique desk, the divorce filing glowing on the screen. He called their life together stagnant. He insinuated the child she was carrying might not be his. He reminded her she had no career, no savings, and now no family to run to. Then he turned and walked out, got into his gleaming sports car, and sped away, never once glancing in his rearview mirror. He left her there, a ghost in her own father's house, her hands protectively cradling her belly, the sound of her own ragged sobs filling the silence. Julian was certain he had won, that Ellie was shattered beyond repair, destined for a life of obscurity and struggle. But what Julian didn't know, what his towering ego could never have conceived, was that the quiet librarian in the casket, the man he'd always dismissed as painfully ordinary, had been nurturing a secret portfolio worth $900 million. And every last cent of it now belonged to Eleanor. This is a tale of cold-hearted betrayal and unchecked greed. It's about a man who discarded the single greatest treasure of his life, and the woman who emerged from the wreckage stronger than ever and completely untouchable. Stick with us, because you will not want to miss the moment Julian finally learns the truth. This story holds a lesson we think is vital for everyone to hear. Your value is never defined by the person who walks away. The people who leave you are not diminishing your worth. They are forfeiting their own chance at a blessing. Sometimes the most powerful response isn't revenge or confrontation, but to simply build a life so full of success, strength, and peace that the person who tried to break you becomes nothing more than a footnote in your story. If this resonates with you, please take a second to like this video, drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from, share this with someone who needs this message today, and subscribe so you don't miss another story that could reshape your perspective on your own strength. Julian was convinced his wife would fall apart. He had pictured this moment, standing on the edge of the quiet suburban street, imagining Eleanor's collapse from a safe distance. And he felt absolutely nothing. No regret, no sorrow, certainly no love. He had watched her at the graveside service, her pregnant silhouette outlined against the dreary sky, and his only thought was how utterly exhausted he was by her. He was tired of her quiet moods, tired of her dependence, tired of her simple, uncomplicated love. Today was the day. He'd made the choice weeks ago, waiting only for the perfect tactical moment. Some might call a funeral the most monstrous time to serve your pregnant wife with divorce papers, but Julian saw it as efficient. Eleanor was already at her lowest point. Her father was gone. She was emotionally fragile and utterly alone. She would sign the documents on the tablet without a fight, too weak to resist. That's what Julian craved. A clean, surgical split. No messy arguments, no expensive lawyers, just a quick signature, and he would be free. Hello everyone, and welcome to our channel. Before we dive in, please help us out by liking this video and subscribing. Also, let us know in the comments where you're joining us from. Are you in Austin or Manchester or Sydney or Cape Town? We'd be thrilled to hear from you. Now let's return to the story. The air at the cemetery was damp and still, broken only by muted sobs. It was a classic Seattle morning, overcast and gray, with the sky threatening a persistent drizzle. A small crowd of about 50 people gathered around the open grave, a sea of dark coats and somber faces. Arthur Vance had been a deeply respected man, not for his wealth or power, but for a gentle, steady kindness that left a lasting impression. Eleanor stood at the front, her hand resting on the curve of her belly. Every so often, she felt a soft flutter, a gentle kick, as if the life inside her was offering silent reassurance. "I'm still here, Mom. Don't be afraid." But Eleanor was afraid. She was terrified. Her father had been her anchor, the one person who gave her unwavering honesty and unconditional love. When she was a child, frightened by monsters in the dark, he would sit with her until she slept. When she was a teenager, nursing a broken heart, he would tell her she was worth more than all the stars in the sky. After she married Julian and moved to the city, her father had called every evening just to hear her voice. Now that voice was silenced forever, and Eleanor felt as if her tether to the world had been cut, leaving her to drift in a cold, empty void. "Are you holding up?" her cousin Chloe whispered, placing a gentle hand on her arm. Eleanor managed a small nod, but she was nowhere near okay. She hadn't been okay since the call came 3 days earlier, informing her that her father had passed in his sleep, as if there was anything peaceful about having your entire world ripped away. Her eyes scanned the small crowd for Julian. He should have been by her side. That's what husbands did. They stood with their wives, held their hands, and murmured words of comfort. But Julian wasn't beside her. He was standing several feet back, arms crossed, impatiently scrolling through his phone. His face was a mask of sheer boredom, the kind one wears when stuck in an endless meeting. He looked at his father-in-law's funeral as a profound inconvenience. Eleanor whispered his name. "Julian, can you please just hold my hand?" He glanced up from his screen, and for a fleeting second, their eyes met. She searched his face for a flicker of something. Compassion, love, even a shred of basic human decency. But his eyes were cold, hard, and empty. "I have to take this," he muttered, already turning away. He walked toward the edge of the cemetery, pressing the phone to his ear. Eleanor watched him go, a hollow ache spreading through her chest. He strode right past her father's casket without a second look. She saw him pull his keys from his pocket and lean against his car, actually laughing at something the person on the other end said, laughing during her father's funeral. The officiant began to speak. "We gathered today to celebrate the life of Arthur Vance, a good man, a devoted father, a quiet hero whose kindness was a gift to all who knew him." Eleanor tried to focus, to be present in this last moment, but her vision blurred with tears that fell thick and fast. Her hands trembled as she clutched her stomach, feeling the baby stir within her as if it could feel the icy chill of its mother's grief. "I'm so sorry, Dad," Eleanor whispered, her voice too faint for anyone to hear. "I'm so sorry." The service went on. Friends and family came forward to share memories of Arthur Vance. They spoke of his unassuming generosity, his quiet wisdom, and his boundless love for his daughter. An old college roommate told a story of how Arthur once drove 6 hours through a blizzard just to help him fix a furnace. A neighbor tearfully recounted how Arthur had mowed her lawn every summer after her husband died, never expecting so much as a thank you. Eleanor wept through it all, and Julian never returned to her side. After the final prayer, a line formed to offer condolences. People hugged her, careful of her pregnancy, murmuring things like, "Your father was one of a kind, and he's at peace now, dear." Eleanor tried to smile, but every kind word was a fresh reminder of the man she'd lost. Then, through the crowd, she saw Julian walking back from the parking lot. Finally, she thought with a surge of relief, "He's coming back to me." But Julian wasn't coming to comfort her. He strode directly toward her, his face a cold, unreadable mask. Ellie, we need to talk. Now. Eleanor blinked, confused. Now, Julian? The service just ended. It's not over. Can't it wait? No, he said flatly. It can't. Come with me. The tone in his voice sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't anger. It was something far worse. It was finality. The sound of a lock clicking into place. She followed him as he led her away from the mourners, back toward her father's small house next door. Her feet felt like lead in her simple black shoes. He didn't stop in the living room, but guided her into the old study, a room filled with books and the faint scent of pipe tobacco. It was a place of comfort, but now it felt like a cage. Her heart hammered against her ribs. What is this, Julian? She asked. You're scaring me. He reached into his designer coat and pulled out a slim silver tablet. He didn't look at her, he just placed it on the desk between them. I want a divorce, he said. The words hung in the air, but they made no sense. It was as if he were speaking a language she had never heard. What? She whispered, her voice barely audible. You heard me, Julian said, his gaze still fixed on the tablet. I want a divorce. I'm done. The room seemed to spin. She reached out, her hand landing on the back of her father's worn leather chair to keep from falling. Her other hand flew to her belly, a primal instinct to protect her child from the blow. But why? Her voice cracked. Julian, what are you talking about? We're about to have a baby. We're a family. That's the problem, isn't it? He said. And now he finally lifted his head. His eyes were like chips of ice. I'm not even convinced that baby is mine. The cruelty of the accusation stole the air from her lungs. She staggered back a step. How could you say that? She cried, tears of shock and pain streaming down her face. You know there's never been anyone else. You know this is your child. How could you even think such a monstrous thing? I think a lot of things, Ellie, Julian said calmly. I think this marriage was a mistake, and I think I've been miserable for a very long time. And I believe I'm entitled to more, to better, Amelia whispered, her voice cracking. Better than what, Julian? Better than me? Better than our own son? He slid a sleek black portfolio across the polished oak table. The dissolution agreement is in there, he stated, his tone as cold as the ice in his whiskey glass. My signature is already on it. You just need to add yours, and this unpleasantness is over. Amelia stared at the portfolio, her hands shaking so violently the leather seemed to vibrate. All around them, the low hum of conversation and the clinking of silverware filled the air of Boston's newest, most exclusive restaurant, his restaurant. Just hours ago, she thought this was their anniversary dinner. And here was her husband, the man who had vowed to cherish her, serving her divorce papers while their unborn child was kicking inside of her. Julian, please, she pleaded, reaching for his hand, but he recoiled as if her touch were acid. Not like this, not tonight. I'm carrying your baby. We're supposed to be a family. You should have considered that before you let yourself go, he said without a shred of emotion. Before what? Amelia's voice rose, no longer a whisper, turning the heads of a few nearby diners. What did I do? Tell me, Julian, what was my unforgivable crime? You became a bore, Amelia. His voice was laced with contempt. You're constantly exhausted, perpetually sentimental. All you do is nest. You stop taking care of yourself. Just look at you. You've completely lost your figure. I'm pregnant, she cried, the tears now flowing freely. I am 7 months pregnant with our child. Of course I'm tired. Of course my body has changed. How can you be so utterly heartless? I'm not being heartless, Julian said, meticulously straightening his tie as if discussing a business deal. I'm being pragmatic. I don't love you, Amelia. I haven't for a very long time, and I'm done with the charade. Amelia wrapped her arms protectively around her stomach, feeling the baby kick frantically, sensing her distress. She felt the room spin, a wave of nausea washing over her. She wanted to scream, to shatter the crystal glasses on the table, to escape this waking nightmare. Just sign the papers, he said. Make it clean for everyone. No, Amelia replied, her voice trembling but with a new, sharp edge of defiance. "I won't sign them. You don't get to discard me like I'm one of your failed projects." "Fine," Julian shrugged, unfazed. "We'll go to court, but believe me, Amelia, that is not a fight you want to have with me. You have nothing, no career since you left the gallery, no income, no real assets. That brownstone your mother left you is a crumbling liability. You have absolutely nothing, and you will not win." Each word was a deliberate, twisting blade. The worst part was, he was right. Amelia had resigned from her curator position at his insistence so she could have a stress-free pregnancy. He had promised to take care of everything. He said her focus should be on their family, and she had believed him because she loved him, because she trusted him. "How could you do this?" she sobbed, the words catching in her throat. "How can you be so cruel?" Julian didn't reply. He glanced at his platinum watch, a picture of impatience. "I have another engagement," he said. "Sign the papers, Amelia. It's finished." And with that, he stood up and walked away. He strode through his restaurant without a single backward glance, past the curious stares and the bowing staff. He stepped into his waiting town car, which silently pulled away from the curb and vanished into the city lights. Amelia watched it go, and then her strength finally gave out. She slumped in her chair, a lone figure at a table for two. She clutched her belly and wept, a silent, racking grief that shook her entire body. Her friend Chloe was the first one she called. "Amelia? Oh my God, what's wrong? Are you okay? Is it the baby?" But Amelia couldn't form words. All she could do was cry and hold her stomach, a primal sound of pain escaping her lips as her perfect world crumbled into dust. Someone from the restaurant staff must have called Chloe back, worried Amelia was in premature labor. Chloe arrived in minutes, her face a mask of fury and concern. She helped Amelia up, guiding her past the sympathetic glances of the waitstaff. Chloe drove her to the old Beacon Hill brownstone, the one Amelia had inherited from her mother, the only place Julian couldn't touch. He had always hated the house, calling it a dusty relic. Chloe guided Amelia inside and onto a chaise lounge covered by a drop cloth. She brought her a glass of water that Amelia couldn't drink. She draped a quilt over her that Amelia couldn't feel. She murmured soothing words that Amelia couldn't hear. Amelia just laid there, staring at the high, tin-plated ceiling of her late mother's house, clutching the cold, black portfolio that held the end of her marriage. She wondered how a single evening could obliterate a lifetime of love. Her husband was gone. She was 30 weeks pregnant with no job, no money, and nowhere to turn. In the space of a single dinner, Amelia Hayes had lost her entire world, or so it seemed. For the next week, Amelia moved through a thick haze. She only ate when Chloe sat with her, spooning soup into her mouth. She only slept when her body gave in to utter exhaustion. She ignored her phone, which buzzed incessantly with calls from Julian's attorney, a man with a voice like gravel, demanding she sign the papers. She would sit in her mother's old painting studio, surrounded by canvases that still smelled faintly of oil paint and turpentine, and stare out the window. The house was deafeningly silent. No husband's footsteps on the stairs, no deep voice calling her name, no sound but the settling of an old foundation. The black portfolio remained on the mantelpiece, a dark omen. Every time she looked at it, she felt a fresh wave of despair. Signing it would be the final admission of defeat. It would mean her marriage, her family, her future were all truly gone. Chloe visited daily, bringing groceries and a fierce, protective energy. "You have to eat," she'd insist. "That little boy in there needs his mom to be strong." Amelia would manage a few bites just to appease her before the food turned to ash in her mouth. At night, she'd lie in her mother's old bed and speak to her son. "I'm so sorry," she'd whisper into the darkness, her hands cupping her belly. "I am so sorry your father doesn't want us, but I promise you, my love, I will be enough for both of us. I will never, ever leave you." The baby would stir, a strong, reassuring kick, and Amelia would cry herself to a fitful sleep. Then, one Friday morning, her phone chimed with an unfamiliar number. Amelia nearly ignored it, assuming it was another tactic from Julian's legal team, but something compelled her to answer. "Hello?" she said, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Am I speaking with Amelia Hayes?" a man asked. His voice was warm, cultured, and kind. "Yes. Who is this?" "My name is Alistair Finch. I am an art historian. I was a dear, dear friend of your mother, Eleanor Hayes. I was overseas and only just learned of her passing. I am so terribly sorry for your loss, my dear." Amelia felt a fresh sting of tears. "Thank you," she managed to say. "Miss Hayes," he continued, "I know this is an imposition, but I was hoping I might be able to visit her studio. There are some matters regarding her collection that I believe are of the utmost importance." Amelia paused, confused. Her collection? My mother just painted for herself. It was her passion, not a collection. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Then Mr. Finch spoke again, very gently. "Amelia, please, trust me. I need to see the studio. This is incredibly important." Something in his tone, a quiet urgency that cut through her fog of grief, made her agree. She gave him the address. He offered to come that very afternoon. He wasn't a lawyer from a high-rise downtown. He was coming to her. A knot of nervous energy began to form in her stomach. Why would an art historian care so much about her mother, a woman who lived quietly and never sold a single painting in her life? For the first time in days, she showered. She put on a simple cotton maternity dress and brushed the tangles from her hair. She didn't look in the mirror. What was the point? He arrived precisely at 2:00. Alistair Finch was a man in his late 70s, impeccably dressed in a tweed jacket, with eyes that sparkled with intelligence and kindness. He looked around the dusty, cluttered studio, not at the mess, but at the dozens of canvases stacked against every wall. A warm smile touched his lips. "You must be Amelia," he said, shaking her hand gently. "You have your mother's eyes." He followed her into the main studio, a large room with a skylight, and how his breath caught. He walked slowly around the space, his gaze sweeping over the vibrant, powerful paintings. "I haven't seen any of this work in 30 years, he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Eleanor was so reclusive. After you were born, she just vanished from the world." Amelia followed him, her heart thumping in her chest. "I'm sorry, sir," she said. "Vanished from what world?" Alistair turned to face her, his expression one of pure astonishment. "My dear girl," he said, "your mother didn't just paint as a hobby. She was Eleanor Hayes. In the 90s, she was the most promising abstract expressionist of her generation. Her early work sells for millions." He gestured to a large, breathtaking canvas of swirling blues and golds. She told the world she had given up painting. No one knew she was still creating. Amelia stared at him, the words failing to connect in her mind. They were just sounds, empty of meaning. I don't understand," she stammered. "Your mother, Eleanor Hayes," Alistair said, his voice ringing with conviction, "built this collection in secret for over 25 years. It's her magnum opus. It is, without exaggeration, one of the most important undiscovered art collections in the world." He looked around the room, then back at her, his kind eyes seeing her, truly seeing her for the first time. "Amelia, Julian didn't leave you with nothing. He left you with everything. He constructed a real estate empire that redefined the New York City skyline. His company is now valued at over $20 billion. Chloe stared in disbelief. "No, that's impossible." "My father lived in a modest Brooklyn brownstone. He drove a beat-up old Volvo. He wore the same tweed coat for a decade. He was just an architect, a historian. That is, because he was the most grounded man I have ever met. Ms. Albright explained he had no interest in the trappings of wealth. His passion was for you. He wanted you to grow up with a normal life, to appreciate history and art. Not just a balance sheet, but why wouldn't he tell me?" Chloe asked, her voice cracking with a pain that felt brand new. Why would he hide his entire life from his own daughter? Ms. Albright let out a long, slow breath. "He had his reasons, Miss Vance, very good." Reasons about 3 years ago, your father liquidated his personal portfolio he was getting on in years. He wanted to truly retire and focus on what mattered most to him. You and the coming of his first grandchild. Chloe's hand instinctively covered her belly. Her dad had been over the moon about the baby. He'd already started a collection of antique children's books for the nursery. When he sold his shares, Ms. Albright continued, he transferred a significant sum into a private trust. How much? Chloe asked, her voice barely a whisper. Ms. Albright opened a polished mahogany box and slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. Chloe glanced down at it. At the very bottom of the page was a figure. She had to read it once, twice, a third time to even comprehend it. $950 million. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Chloe clutched the sides of the leather chair. They can't be real, she breathed. It is entirely real, Miss Albright confirmed. And according to your father's final directive, every last cent belongs to you. You are his sole beneficiary, his only heir. Chloe felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. She literally could not take a breath. She pressed a hand to her chest, trying to inhale, but her lungs refused to cooperate. Miss Vance, are you all right? Ms. Albright asked, standing up from her desk. Should I call for a doctor? I'm fine, Chloe gasped. I don't understand. Why would he hide this from me? Ms. Albright's expression softened into one of grave seriousness. Miss Vance, your father did not trust your husband. What? Chloe looked up, her eyes sharp with confusion. Your father was an exceptional judge of character. Ms. Albright went on. He saw the way Leo treated you. He paid attention to how Leo was always steering conversations toward money, always asking about your family's assets. Your father told me, and I quote, Leo doesn't love my daughter. He loves the idea of her name and what he thinks it can unlock for him. Chloe felt the room grow cold. My father said that yes, he was terribly worried for you, especially once you told him you were pregnant. He wanted to tell you everything, but he feared that if Leo discovered the truth, he would find a way to exploit it. He was afraid Leo would try to secure the money and then leave you with absolutely nothing. Tears began to trace paths down Chloe's cheeks. He was trying to protect me. Yes, Miss Albright said gently. He made me swear an oath not to reveal this until after his passing. He said that once he was gone, you would need these resources to care for yourself and your child. He wanted to ensure that you and his grandchild would be secure for the rest of your lives. Chloe finally broke. She wept with her entire being, deep, gut-wrenching sobs that came from a place of profound love and loss. She didn't know existed. Her father had known all along. He had seen the truth behind Leo's charm when she had been blind to it, and he had used the last years of his life to build a fortress around her, a fortress so impenetrable that nothing could ever harm her or her baby. Oh, Dad, Chloe whispered through her tears. I'm so sorry I didn't see it. I'm so sorry I didn't trust you. Chloe left Ms. Albright's office that afternoon feeling like a stranger in her own skin. The grief was still a heavy cloak on her shoulders, but beneath the weight of that sorrow, a new feeling was taking root. Something that felt like the first rays of dawn after a long, dark night. Hope. She took a cab back to the apartment and sat on the edge of the sofa. The divorce papers Leo had pushed on her were still on the coffee table, unsigned. Chloe stared at them for what felt like an eternity. Then she picked up her laptop, opened a new document, and began to type. At the top of the page. She wrote the Vance Protocol rule number. On. Play the part. Chloe considered this from every angle. She could unleash a storm. She could tell everyone how he demanded a divorce the moment she told him she was pregnant. She could ruin his reputation, but what would be the point? It would only create a public spectacle, and unbearable stress, and stress was the last thing her baby needed. No, Chloe would choose the path of quiet dignity. She would be tactical. Rule number 2. The fortune does not exist. This was the cornerstone of the entire plan. Ms. Albright had been adamant if Leo caught wind of the inheritance before the ink on the divorce was dry, he would turn her life into a legal battlefield. He would drag her through the courts for years, attempting to stake a claim on her father's legacy. The money was her armor. It was her child's future. It had to remain a complete secret rule number. 3. The heir is paramount, every single thing. Chloe did from this day on would serve a single goal, keeping her child safe, secure, and cherished. Rule number 4, build a new foundation. Chloe couldn't stay in this apartment every corner. Held a memory of a life that was now a lie. She needed a clean slate, a new sanctuary where she could construct a new life from the very beginning. She read over her list and felt a sensation that had been absent for months. Control. She was seizing the narrative of her own life. She picked up her phone and sent a text to Ms. Albright. "I've made up my mind," Chloe wrote. "I'm going to sign his papers." There was a short pause before the reply came. "Are you certain?" Ms. Albright texted back. "Yes, Leo wants out. Fine, he'll get it. But with my conditions, I'm listening. I want sole legal and physical custody, no visitation unless mandated by a court after a full psychological evaluation, and I want it stipulated that he is voluntarily terminating all parental rights. That is an excellent strategy." Ms. Albright replied. Chloe could almost hear the approval in the words. "If he signs that he has no legal ground to come back into the child's life later." "Precisely," Chloe typed, "and one last thing, I need to relocate." "Ms. Albright, my father, you mentioned he owned other properties. Is there someplace safe I can go? Your father owned a magnificent estate in the Hudson Valley, 20 acres of private land, utterly secluded and secure. I can arrange for you to see it tomorrow morning. Please do." Chloe wrote back the next morning. Ms. Albright drove Chloe upstate as they passed through ornate iron gates and rounded a bend in the long gravel driveway. Chloe gasped. The house was breathtaking, 3 stories of elegant brickwork with towering windows that gleamed in the morning sun, a sprawling veranda with white columns, emerald lawns rolled out in every direction. Ancient willow trees stood like guardians by the driveway, and there was a walled garden overflowing with flowers and a small pond with a stone bench beside it. "My father owned this," Chloe whispered. "He acquired it a decade ago." Ms. Albright said he told me this was his real legacy project. He wanted it to be a haven for you and your family, a place where his grandchildren could run and explore in total safety. Chloe pressed her hand against the cool glass of the window. Looking at the mansion through a haze of tears, she knew her father had built this for a future he envisioned. For her, for the grandchild he would never meet. It was a dream he never saw realized. "I'm going to live here," Chloe whispered, her voice barely audible. "This is where my baby will grow up." Mr. Albright, her father's attorney, gave a gentle smile. "Then it is yours." In the 2 weeks that followed, Chloe breathed life back into the sprawling lakefront property. A team of cleaners was brought in to polish every surface until it shone. Movers carefully transported the few cherished items from the small home she once shared with her father. She collaborated with a renowned designer to craft a serene and magical nursery, with walls the color of a dawn sky and a ceiling painted with delicate silver stars. A custom-built ashwood crib stood in the center, and shelves were filled with classic storybooks and handcrafted toys. At Mr. Albright's insistence, she also contracted a top-tier security firm. They installed a discreet but comprehensive camera network across the grounds and posted 2 guards at the main gate, 24 hours a day. "No one sets foot on this property unless you personally approve it," the security chief assured her. "You and your child will be absolutely safe." Chloe also followed his other piece of advice and scheduled an appointment with a therapist. Her name was Dr. Anya Sharma, a woman whose kindness was matched only by her straightforwardness. "You've experienced a profound trauma," Dr. Sharma stated in their first meeting. "The death of your father, followed by the desertion of your husband while you were pregnant. These are significant emotional injuries. They require dedicated healing." She leaned forward slightly. "Asking for help isn't a sign of weakness, Chloe. It's one of the most courageous things a person can do." With Dr. Sharma's guidance, Chloe started to navigate the emotional tempest that had been raging inside her. She learned to accept that feeling white-hot anger toward Ethan was valid. She learned that grief wasn't a linear process, but a winding path, filled with days of light and days of crushing darkness. Most importantly, she learned that she didn't have to be perfect. She just had to keep moving forward. Slowly, one day at a time, Chloe began to mend. Her mornings were spent taking long, peaceful walks along the shoreline of the estate. She focused on nourishing food and found that her sleep was deeper and more restful. She spoke to her unborn child constantly, a running monologue of hope. "We're going to be just fine," she would murmur, her hand on her belly as she passed by the old oak trees. "We're going to build an amazing life for ourselves here. I promise." And for the first time since her entire world had fractured, Chloe truly believed it. While Chloe was quietly piecing her life back together, Ethan was discovering that the paradise he had chosen was nothing but a mirage. In fact, it was a barren wasteland. The trouble began, as it often does, with money. Ethan sat on the plush sofa of their suite at the peninsula, staring at the invoice in his hands. $15,000 for 1 month. His face flushed a deep, mottled red. "This has to be a mistake," he muttered. Sophia, his girlfriend, glanced over from the vanity where she was applying makeup. A lock of her platinum blonde hair draped over her shoulder. "Well, there's the suite itself, darling, and daily room service, the couple's massages, my daily appointments at the spa, plus that tasting menu at Alania last week." All right, I get it," Ethan snapped. "We have to start cutting back." Sophia, however, had no interest in cutting back. She wanted to expand. "Ethan, I'm over-living in a hotel," she announced, turning to face him with her arms crossed. "I need a proper apartment, something in the Gold Coast, with a 24-hour doorman, a private gym, and a rooftop infinity pool. You did promise me a certain lifestyle, remember?" "Sophia, places like that are incredibly expensive," Ethan argued. "So?" she retorted, her voice sharp. "You told me your architecture firm was booming. You said you'd handle everything. Was all of that just talk?" "Of course not," Ethan said, a little too quickly, feeling a bead of sweat trail down his spine. The reality was that his boutique architecture firm, once a rising star in the Chicago design scene, was in freefall. It was hemorrhaging clients, and the cause was painfully clear. Ethan had completely checked out. He was blowing off client meetings, ignoring urgent calls, and missing crucial project deadlines. He had become so utterly consumed by Sophia and their whirlwind, high-stakes lifestyle that he'd abandoned the very thing that funded it. One after another, his clients had terminated their contracts. With no clients came no income, and with no income, there was no way to afford the 5-star hotel, the Michelin star restaurants, the designer handbags, and the endless stream of gifts he bought Sophia to keep her placated. To make matters worse, the sleek, modern condo he'd shared with Chloe, which he had counted on selling for a quick, substantial profit, was languishing on the market without a single serious offer. The realtor claimed the market was in a downturn. Ethan was convinced the realtor was an idiot. "I just need you to be a little patient," Ethan pleaded with Sophia. "Just give me a few more weeks and I'll have it all sorted out." Sophia's eyes narrowed into slits. "You've been singing that same song for a month now." Their arguments grew more common, becoming a near-nightly ritual. Sophia would lament their hotel accommodations. Ethan would lash out about her spending. She would threaten to walk out. He would make grand promises he had no way of keeping. It was a toxic, accelerating spiral. One evening, right in the middle of another explosive fight, Ethan's phone buzzed. It was his lawyer, Mr. Davidson. "Ethan, we need to have a serious conversation," the lawyer said, his tone grim. "Chloe signed the divorce papers." A wave of pure relief washed over Ethan. It was the first piece of good news he'd received in what felt like an eternity. "But she stipulated some conditions," Mr. Davidson added. "What kind of conditions?" Ethan asked, the relief vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. "She is demanding sole, uncontested custody of the child, and she wants you to terminate all your parental rights, permanently." She can't just do that. Ethan yelled into the phone. Actually, Ethan, she can, his lawyer replied evenly. And frankly, between us, I don't think you're in any position to fight her on this. If you contest custody, she'll almost certainly file for child support. And given the current state of your finances, that would be financially catastrophic for you. Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but the words caught in his throat. His lawyer was right. He was completely broke. He couldn't afford a protracted legal battle. And if he were being brutally honest with himself, he never really wanted the responsibility of a child. He had only used the threat of a custody fight to instill fear in Chloe. Fine, Ethan said, the word dripping with resentment. I'll sign them. A wise decision, Mr. Davidson said. I'll have the documents couriered to you tomorrow. Ethan ended the call and stared blankly at the wall. Sophia had been listening from the other side of the room. So you're just giving up the kid? She asked. I don't have another option, Ethan shot back. What about the child support? Sophia pushed. You could be getting a check from her every single month. Chloe doesn't have any money, Ethan said, exhaustion lacing his voice. Her dad was just some retired engineer. He probably didn't leave her a dime. There's no use fighting for support when there's nothing there to begin with. Sophia made a sound of pure, unadulterated contempt. So you torched your entire life for nothing? No condo, no baby, no income stream. What exactly was the point of all this, Ethan? The point was you, he screamed, his voice raw. I left all of that for you because you told me we would be happy, Sophia screamed back. Well, I am not happy. I'm stuck in a hotel we can't afford with a man who is going bankrupt. And to be perfectly honest, Ethan, I'm beginning to think I made a catastrophic mistake. The words hung in the charged air between them, thick and suffocating like smoke. 2 weeks later, Ethan signed away his parental rights. The divorce was finalized. He tried to convince himself that he was relieved, that he was finally free. But in the dead of night, when Sophia was sound asleep and the city lights painted silent patterns on the ceiling, Ethan would lie awake, his mind drifting back to Chloe. He wondered where she had gone. He wondered how the pregnancy was going. He wondered, for the very first time, if he had just made the single worst decision of his life. He attempted to call her once, then twice, then 5 times in 1 week. Each time, the call went directly to her voicemail. Chloe, he said in one message, his voice cracking with an emotion he couldn't name. I know I messed everything up. I know I hurt you, but I still worry about you and the baby. Please, just text me to let me know you're okay. She never responded, not once. It was a Thursday afternoon, 6 weeks after the divorce had been finalized, and Ethan was sitting alone in the silent hotel suite. He was aimlessly scrolling through an architectural design magazine on his tablet while Sophia was out, likely maxing out the last of his available credit. He was scanning headlines, his mind numb, when a name stopped his thumb mid-scroll. Reclusive developer Harrison Vance. Harrison Vance. That was Chloe's father's name. But it had to be a coincidence. There were probably dozens of Harrison Vances in the world. This couldn't be him. He tapped the headline. The article loaded, and Ethan began to read. The real estate world was stunned this week by the passing of Harrison Vance, the visionary but intensely private founder of Vanguard Properties, one of the nation's most influential development firms. But even more shocking was the revelation that Vance, who lived a life shrouded in secrecy, has left his entire estate, estimated to be worth over $900 million, to a single, previously unknown heir. Ethan's heart began to hammer against his ribs. He forced himself to keep reading. Vance liquidated his controlling interest in Vanguard Properties 3 years ago for a sum that sources familiar with the transaction place at approximately $900 million. He subsequently vanished from the public eye, choosing to live simply in a modest suburban home. Modest suburban home, simply. Ethan's hands began to tremble violently. According to Vance's longtime attorney, Mr. Robert Albright of Albright and Finch, The entirety of the Vance fortune has been transferred to his sole surviving child. Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. The identity of the heir has now been confirmed as Chloe Vance, age 29. And then he saw the photograph. It was Chloe, but not the Chloe he remembered. Not the weeping, shattered woman he had abandoned in a lawyer's office. This Chloe was luminous. She stood on the grand stone steps of a breathtaking lakefront mansion, wearing a simple but elegant maternity gown that proudly accentuated her pregnant form. Her hair was styled, her skin was radiant, and she wore a soft, serene smile that conveyed a deep sense of peace and belonging. The caption beneath the image read, "Chloe Vance, heiress to the $900 million Vance fortune, photographed at her late father's private Chicago estate." Ethan dropped the tablet. It clattered against the floor, landing face up on the expensive rug, the image of Chloe's glowing face staring up at him like a judgment. "No," Ethan whispered, the word a strangled breath. No, this isn't real. This can't be happening." $950 million, his ex-wife, the woman he had condescendingly called quaint, the woman he had discarded like an old suit, was worth $950 million. He had divorced one of the wealthiest heiresses in the state. He had signed away his rights to the child of one of the wealthiest heiresses in the state. He had done it willingly. Eagerly, he had practically skipped out of the lawyer's office laughing. Leo shot up from the hotel bed so fast he sent the bedside lamp crashing to the floor in a shower of porcelain and glass. But he didn't even flinch. His entire body was trembling. His vision was swimming. He felt a wave of nausea rise in his throat at that precise moment. The door to the suite swung open and Isabel breezed in, juggling 4 designer shopping bags. "Leo, you won't believe the deal I got at." She stopped dead when she saw his face. "What's happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." Leo couldn't form words. He just stood there, his jaw working silently. Isabel dropped the bags on the floor and rushed to his side. She picked up his tablet. She read the headline. She scrolled down the article. She saw the photo of Chloe, and then Isabel let out a scream. It was a raw, piercing shriek that could have probably been heard down in the lobby. $950 million. Isabel screamed. Chloe has $950 million. What followed was the most vicious fight of their entire affair. They raged at each other for nearly an hour. Isabel called Leo the single stupidest man to ever walk the earth. Leo fired back that Isabel was the one who had pushed him to finalize the divorce so quickly. Isabel hissed that if she had had any clue about the money, she would have told him to stay married and carry on their affair in secret. Leo said that was appalling. Isabel said he had no room to talk about morals after his behavior at the funeral. On and on they went, trading blame and insults like ammunition. But beneath all the fury was the same sickening shared knowledge they had overplayed their hand. They had bet everything on their own greed, and they had lost spectacularly. Finally, Leo snatched his wallet and keys from the dresser. "Where are you going?" Isabel demanded. "To find Chloe." Leo said through gritted teeth, "I have to fix this." He drove like a man possessed, blowing through stop signs and weaving through traffic until he reached the private airfield. The iron gates were shut tight, and a uniformed security guard stepped out from a small gatehouse. "I'm here for Eleanor Vance," Julian said, his breath catching in his chest. "I'm her husband, that is, her ex-husband." The security chief at the front desk consulted a tablet. "I'm sorry, Mr. Croft. You are not on the approved access list for this floor." Julian's voice rose with desperation. He pleaded, his voice cracking, but a second security officer emerged, his build far more imposing than the first. "Eleanor!" Julian shouted toward the towering wall of glass. "Eleanor, I know you're up there. I was wrong. I'm so sorry. I still love you." "Eleanor, please." His voice was swallowed by the city noise, a pathetic plea lost in the downtown bustle. No one responded. Security informed him that if he did not vacate the premises, they would call the Boston police. Julian returned to his car, staring up at the monolithic headquarters of the Vance Foundation for 5 minutes, praying for a sign that never came. What Julian couldn't see was Eleanor, watching him on a security monitor from her 40th floor office. She saw his frantic gestures, heard the tinny echo of his voice through the speaker, and felt absolutely nothing. No rage, no pity, no triumph, just a quiet emptiness. She placed a hand over her swelling stomach, felt a gentle kick from within, and switched off the monitor. 2 days after being ejected from the Foundation's headquarters, Julian sat in his lawyer's office, his eyes wide with a frantic scheme. "I want to contest the divorce settlement," Julian announced. Mr. Adler simply stared at him. "Julian, you cannot contest a settlement that you yourself drafted and pushed through, simply because your circumstances have changed. Why not? People have regrets." Mr. Adler removed his spectacles and polished them slowly. "Julian, if you walk into a courtroom and tell a judge you want to invalidate your divorce agreement because you just read in a financial journal that your ex-wife now chairs a multi-billion-dollar philanthropic foundation, do you know what will happen? What? The judge will thank you for the most transparent case of gold digging she's seen all year and then sanction you for wasting the court's time." Julian's face flushed with anger, but he pressed on. "What about the baby? I signed away my rights. Can I get them back?" "You signed a legally ironclad declaration of non-paternity," Mr. Adler said, his tone deliberate. "You stated in no uncertain terms that you wish to have no legal or paternal connection to the child." "I've had a change of heart," Julian said, his jaw set. "The law is not concerned with your change of heart," Mr. Adler countered. "You made a calculated decision." A long, tense silence filled the room. "I cannot represent you in this," Mr. Adler said finally, "and frankly, I will not. What you're attempting is morally bankrupt, and any judge in the Commonwealth will see it for what it is." Julian left in a fury. He found another attorney, a man named Finch, who had fewer scruples and was happy to take his retainer to file for parental custody. They faced each other in court 3 weeks later. Eleanor arrived with Miss Chen and 2 other lawyers from a top Boston firm. She was dressed in an elegant navy maternity dress, her expression serene and unreadable. Her pregnancy was advanced now. She was nearly 8.5 months along. Julian arrived with Mr. Finch, wearing his best suit, which was beginning to fray slightly at the sleeves. He tried to look confident, but a cold dread was pooling in his stomach. The judge was a woman in her 60s, Judge Esposito, with sharp, intelligent eyes, salt and pepper hair in a neat bun, and a look that conveyed she had seen and heard every lie imaginable in her 25 years of service. "Mr. Finch," Judge Esposito said, peering at Julian's lawyer over her glasses, "you are petitioning this court to grant custody rights to a child not yet born. A child whose biological father, your client, voluntarily and unequivocally relinquished all parental claims just 2 months ago. Please enlighten me." Mr. Finch rose. "Your Honor, my client, Julian Croft, has had an opportunity to reconsider his previous choices. He recognizes now that he acted under severe emotional and professional pressure. He deeply loves his unborn child and wants to be a responsible and present father." Judge Esposito then shifted her focus to Julian. "Mr. Croft, is that an accurate summary?" Julian stood, his heart hammering. He had rehearsed this in his reflection 100 times. "Yes, Your Honor, I made an unforgivable mistake. I was navigating a profoundly difficult period in my life, and I was not of sound mind when I signed those documents. But with time and clarity, I know that I want nothing more than to be a father to my child." It was a passable delivery, but then Eleanor's lawyer, Miss Chen, rose. "Your Honor, with the court's permission?" "Proceed, Miss Chen," the judge nodded. "Your Honor, Mr. Croft's statement is a complete fabrication. He is not here today out of a newfound sense of paternal duty. He is here because he seeks access to my client's inheritance and the Vance Foundation's endowment." "That's a lie," Julian shouted. Judge Esposito's gavel struck the wood with a sharp crack. "Order! Mr. Croft, you will get your chance to speak. Miss Chen, continue." Miss Chen approached the bench, handing the judge a thick binder. Your Honor, we have gathered significant evidence that reveals Mr. Croft's actual motivations. Judge Esposito opened the binder, and as she flipped through the pages, her expression turned to stone. First, Miss Chen began, we have a series of emails between Mr. Croft and his associate, a Miss Chloe Summers, dated just 3 days ago. In these emails, Mr. Croft plainly states, and I am quoting from the exhibit, that he needs custody to secure a foothold in the Vance fortune and get the funding to finally launch his firm properly. Julian felt as if the floor had fallen out from under him. Second, we have credit card records showing Mr. Croft was staying at a boutique hotel with Miss Summers for the entirety of the week of his father-in-law's death and funeral. Third, we have sworn affidavits from 23 attendees of Mr. Vance's funeral reception. Every single statement describes the same event, Mr. Croft cornering his pregnant, grieving wife beside her father's portrait and serving her with divorce papers while she was accepting condolences. Multiple witnesses describe Mrs. Vance becoming physically ill from the shock. Multiple witnesses attest that Mr. Croft then left the reception without a backward glance. The courtroom was utterly still. Julian felt a desperate urge to simply vanish. And finally, Miss Chen concluded, we have Mr. Croft's own signed and notarized declaration from 2 months prior in which he willingly surrendered all parental rights. In that very document, he also included a clause questioning the child's paternity, despite possessing absolutely no grounds to suspect infidelity on the part of Mrs. Vance. Judge Esposito snapped the binder shut. She looked directly at Julian, her eyes as cold and gray as the Atlantic in winter. Mr. Croft, she said, her voice low and dangerous, is the content of this binder accurate? Julian looked frantically toward Mr. Finch, but his lawyer was silent, offering no defense, no objection, no hope. I can explain, Julian stammered. Can you? Judge Esposito challenged. Explain to this court why you chose your wife's father's funeral reception to serve her divorce papers. Explain why you cast doubt on the paternity of your own child. Explain why you surrendered your parental rights, and then, 2 months later, upon learning of your ex-wife's financial standing, you suddenly feel compelled to be a doting father. Julian opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. Judge Esposito nodded, his silence the only confession she needed. Mr. Croft, I have presided over family court for 25 years. I have seen the best and worst of human nature, but rarely have I witnessed an individual whose actions so blatantly prove that a child's welfare is the absolute last thing on their mind. Every choice you have made, from the cruelty at the funeral to this petition filed just days after reading about the inheritance, screams of one single motive, greed. Your petition for custody is denied with extreme prejudice. Furthermore, I'm issuing a permanent restraining order. You will have no contact, direct or indirect, with Mrs. Vance or her child. Any violation will be met with immediate incarceration. Is that clear? Yes, Your Honor, Julian whispered. I didn't hear you, Judge Esposito said sharply. Yes, Your Honor, Julian choked out, his voice breaking. Mrs. Vance, Judge Esposito said, her tone shifting entirely to one of compassion and respect. You are granted sole legal and physical custody from the moment of your child's birth. Mr. Croft will have no rights, no visitation, and no claim whatsoever. This court wishes you and your baby a peaceful and happy future. Thank you, Your Honor, Eleanor said, her voice quiet but firm. Julian stumbled out of the courtroom, his face burning with shame. People in the corridor averted their eyes, but they had heard. Through the open doors, they had heard everything. They knew exactly who he was. 6 weeks after the hearing, on a bright spring morning as the magnolia trees in the public garden burst into bloom, Eleanor gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The labor was long and arduous, 14 hours in all, but Eleanor discovered a strength in herself she never knew she possessed. And when the nurse finally laid her son on her chest, Eleanor looked at his perfect, tiny face and felt a love so immense, so powerful, It felt like her heart would split wide open. "Hello, my love," she whispered, tears of profound joy tracing paths down her cheeks. "I'm your mother. I have waited my whole life to meet you." The baby opened his deep blue eyes and gazed up at her. In that instant, every awful thing that had transpired over the last year, the betrayal, the grief, the humiliation, the fear, it all dissolved into nothing. None of it held any power anymore because this small, perfect person was in her arms. He was hers, and she was his. That was the only thing that mattered. "What will you name him?" the nurse asked gently. Eleanor didn't have to think. The name had been a quiet certainty for months. "Arthur," she said. "His name is Arthur, after his grandfather." Eleanor remained in the hospital for 2 days. Her room was a garden of flowers, an enormous display of white orchids from Miss Chen, a bright bouquet from a cousin, and countless other arrangements from new friends and colleagues. There were cards and balloons and impossibly small baby gifts. There was nothing from Julian. No note, no call, no acknowledgement. And Eleanor was profoundly grateful for the silence. When she brought baby Arthur home to her Beacon Hill brownstone, everything was waiting. The nursery was a masterpiece of quiet elegance, with a hand-carved cherry wood crib, soft cream-colored linens, and a silver mobile of stars and planets turning slowly in the afternoon light. Turning slowly in the breeze from the open window, books lined the shelves. A plush glider sat by the window, positioned so Eleanor could look out at the Boston skyline while she fed the baby. That first night, Eleanor sat in the glider with Arthur sleeping in her arms. Moonlight poured through the window, painting everything in silver and shadow. "You will never suffer the way I did," Eleanor whispered to her sleeping son. "You will never know betrayal or fear or abandonment. You will grow up surrounded by integrity. You will be cherished. You will be safe." She kissed the top of his tiny head. "Your grandfather wanted this for you," she continued softly. "He worked his entire life so that you could have every opportunity, and I am going to honor his gift. I am going to build something with it. I am going to make him proud." The baby sighed in his sleep, his tiny fingers curling around the collar of Eleanor's silk blouse, and Eleanor smiled through her tears. Over the following months, Eleanor threw herself into building something meaningful. She started the Arthur Vance Legacy Fund, a charity dedicated to helping women rebuild their careers after life-altering personal crises, and their children. The fund provided educational grants, professional mentorship, childcare, and career placement programs. Eleanor remembered too well how gutted she had been when she discovered Julian's plans, how isolated she felt, how hopeless. She did not want any other woman to experience that kind of devastation. She wanted every woman starting over to know that someone believed in them, that support existed, that their current chapter was not the end of their story. The fund grew rapidly. Within its first year, it had helped over 500 families across 3 cities. Eleanor attended the mentorship events regularly, sitting with the women, listening to their stories, playing with their children. One afternoon, a young woman named Maria approached Eleanor at a networking brunch. Maria was 23 with a toddler on her hip and the tired eyes of a fighter. "Mrs. Vance," Maria said quietly, "I just wanted to thank you. When my fiancé left me, I had nothing. No degree, no family nearby. I thought about giving up. I really did. But then someone told me about your fund, and now I have a subsidized apartment. And I'm finishing my design degree at MassArt, and my daughter is in the campus daycare. You saved our lives." Eleanor hugged her. "You saved your own life, Maria. I just helped open a door. You were the one who walked through it." Eleanor also invested wisely, working with her father's expert financial advisors, learning everything she could about biotech and emerging technologies, just as he had done. Some ventures failed, but most succeeded. Her fortune grew steadily. She began speaking publicly about her experience. She gave interviews about professional reinvention, about grief, about rebuilding after betrayal. She never mentioned Julian by name, but everyone knew who she was talking about. The greatest success, Eleanor said in one interview that went viral, is not proving them wrong. It is becoming the person you were always meant to be. It is refusing to let someone else's cruelty define your story. People admired her. Boston magazines featured her on their covers. She won awards for her philanthropy. Universities invited her to deliver keynote addresses to graduating classes. She became a symbol of resilience and grace under pressure. And through it all, little Arthur grew strong and happy and full of wonder. He took his first steps on his first birthday, wobbling across the historic brownstone's enormous library, while Eleanor cheered and clapped and cried happy tears. He was a joyful child, always laughing, always pointing at things, always curious about the world. Eleanor made sure Arthur knew about his grandfather. She told him stories every night about how brilliant Grandpa Arthur was, how generous, how he built an incredible company from nothing, how he loved his grandson before he was even born. Your grandfather was a visionary, sweet boy, Eleanor would tell little Arthur, and you carry his name. That is something to be very proud of. Julian's life went in the opposite direction. After the divorce was finalized, everything collapsed like a building with its foundation removed. First, Chloe left. She sent him a cold, 2-line email one morning saying his personal brand had become toxic and she could no longer be associated with him. She wished him well. Julian tried calling her for 3 days. Every call went straight to voicemail. On the 4th day, the number was disconnected. Chloe, the real estate agent, had vanished from his life as quickly as she had entered it. His architectural firm followed. The last remaining clients, the ones who had stayed out of a misplaced sense of loyalty, finally left. They had read about the divorce. Everyone had. The story of the architect who secretly planned to leave his pregnant wife had spread through Boston's elite circles like wildfire. No one wanted to be associated with Julian Croft. He lost his Seaport office because he could not pay the rent. He sold his Porsche to cover his most pressing debts. He moved out of his luxury loft and into a cramped studio apartment in a rough neighborhood on the far side of the city. The apartment had paper-thin walls, a broken radiator, and a persistent smell of stale beer that no amount of cleaning could remove. Julian spent his days applying for jobs and his nights lying awake in the dark, staring at the cracks in the ceiling. No one would hire him. His reputation was destroyed. The moment any potential employer searched his name online, they found the articles, the society columns, the whispers about what he had done. He was radioactive. Sometimes, late at night, when the apartment was dark and the neighbor's music was bleeding through the thin walls, Julian would take out his phone and scroll through old photographs. There was one from his wedding day, Eleanor smiling at him with so much love in her eyes that it almost hurt to look at. There was another from the day she told him she was pregnant, her face glowing with happiness, holding up the positive test with tears of joy on her cheeks. He had held all of that in his hands, all that love, all that devotion, all that goodness, and he had methodically planned to throw it all away. One afternoon, Julian was walking through downtown, heading to yet another interview that he knew would lead nowhere, when he looked up and saw an advertisement on a digital billboard. It was enormous, stretching across the entire side of a building. The photograph showed Eleanor holding baby Arthur. They were both smiling. Eleanor looked stunning, confident and radiant and completely at peace. The baby was reaching up to touch her face, and she was laughing. The text on the billboard read, "The Arthur Vance Legacy Fund. Empowering communities, one home at a time." Julian Vance stared up at the massive digital billboard dominating the Chicago skyline, oblivious to the river of pedestrians flowing around him. The city's pulse of screeching tires and distant sirens faded into a dull hum. He was frozen, looking at the woman he had discarded, the son he had never met, and felt the hot sting of tears on his cheeks. He couldn't get away from her. Amelia was the city's new icon, her face gracing magazine covers and news segments where she discussed her philanthropic ventures, her shrewd investment in green energy, and her vision for urban renewal. Each article was a testament to his monumental loss. Amelia Hayes pledges $100 million to sustainable tech startups. The Hayes Foundation breaks ground on its 5th affordable housing complex. Amelia Hayes honored as Innovator of the Year. Every headline was a fresh cut, every photo a twist of the knife. A realization, cold and sharp, finally pierced through years of his own arrogance. Amelia had never been dull. She had been profound. She had never been fragile. She had been resilient. She was never insignificant. She had been the cornerstone of his life, and in his cruel blindness, he had demolished it all. And now it was irreversible. The divorce decree was stamped, the parental rights terminated by his own signature, the court order a permanent barrier. There were no more doors to open, no paths left to take, no final chances to plead for. Julian Vance, the man who built empires, had earned precisely what he was left with, an empty foundation. It was a balmy summer evening, nearly a year after little Liam was born. The sprawling lakeside estate was awash in the golden glow of the setting sun, which turned the surface of Lake Michigan into liquid fire. Amelia sat on the veranda in a wicker armchair, watching her son take wobbly steps across the soft lawn. Liam was walking now, a determined little explorer whose chubby legs propelled him from one discovery to the next. He was chasing a firefly, his small hands reaching, a pure, joyous laugh bubbling from his chest. Her sister, Clara, sat with her, a glass of lemonade in her hand. "He has Dad's eyes," Clara murmured. Amelia smiled. "I know. Sometimes when the light catches his profile just so, I can see Dad so clearly it steals my breath." They lapsed into a comfortable silence, watching Liam tumble onto the grass before pushing himself right back up to continue his quest. "Dad would be so incredibly proud of you," Clara said, "not just for the foundation or the success, for how you carried yourself, the grace you showed when you had every reason to shatter." Amelia rocked gently. "You know what I remember most?" she asked quietly. "I think about that afternoon in the parking garage, standing on the cold concrete, clutching that credit card statement, feeling like the entire world had just collapsed beneath me. I was so certain my life was over. I believed I had lost everything, that I was utterly and completely alone." Clara reached over, her hand covering Amelia's. "But I was wrong," Amelia went on. "I wasn't alone. Dad was still looking out for me. He had spent his life building a fortress around me that I never even knew was there. And the baby." Her gaze drifted to Liam, who was now carefully studying a blade of grass with intense focus. "The baby was with me all along, a tiny flutter, a little kick, reminding me that I had a reason to fight." Amelia paused, watching a sailboat glide across the horizon. "I used to believe Julian broke me," she said, her voice soft. "But he didn't. He simply removed himself from my path, and that was the single greatest gift I've ever received. Not the fortune, not the company, none of it. The gift was the freedom to finally become the person I was always meant to be, without a voice constantly whispering that I wasn't good enough." Clara dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. "When did you get to be so profound?" Amelia let out a genuine laugh. "Therapy," she said. "Lots and lots of therapy." Their laughter danced on the evening air, carrying across the lawn to Liam. The little boy glanced up at the sound of his mother's voice and beamed, showing off a set of 4 tiny teeth. He pushed himself up and started toddling toward her as fast as his legs would allow. "Mama!" Liam called, his voice full of purpose. "Mama! Mama!" Amelia rose and met him at the steps, scooping him up into a tight hug, burying her face in his curls that smelled of grass and sunshine. "Hello, my little adventurer," she whispered. "Did you have a good time chasing the lights?" "Lights," Liam repeated with great seriousness, pointing a chubby finger back at the lawn. "That's right," Amelia said. "Fireflies. You are so brilliant, Liam, just like your grandpa." She carried him inside as the last of the sunlight painted the sky in shades of violet and rose. The house was warm, filled with the evidence of a happy life. The hallway was a gallery of memories. There wasn't a photo of a doting grandfather holding a newborn, but there was something better, a large, framed picture of her father, Daniel Hayes, young and grinning in a cluttered garage, standing beside the primitive computer that would eventually become the billion-dollar software giant, Innova. Amelia paused before the portrait, a nightly ritual. "Say goodnight to Grandpa Daniel," she prompted her son. "Nini," Liam chirped, waving his hand at the photo. Amelia smiled and continued up the stairs to the nursery. She changed him into his pajamas, the ones decorated with little sailboats, and settled into the rocking chair by the window to read a story. "Once upon a time," Amelia began softly, "there was a little boat who dreamed of sailing across a great big lake." Liam snuggled into her chest, his breathing already growing deep and steady. He was sound asleep before she even reached the final page. She closed the book, rocking in the quiet room, feeling the steady rhythm of her son's heart against hers. "I need you to know something," she whispered to the sleeping boy. "Your grandfather loved you long before you were even a thought. He dedicated his life to making sure you would always be safe, always be cherished. Everything we have, all of this, is because he loved us." She gently kissed his forehead. "And your father," she continued, her voice even lower. "Your father made choices that I won't be able to explain for a very long time. Perhaps one day, when you're much older, we can talk about it. But this is what you must always remember, Liam. Your worth is not for someone else to decide. Your value isn't measured by another person's inability to see it. You are brilliant. You are cherished. You are more than enough. You always have been." She laid Liam down in his crib, pulling the soft blanket over him. The mobile of tiny planets and stars drifted slowly above his head. Casting delicate shadows across the ceiling, Elara stood in the archway and watched her sleep, her chest a gentle rhythm of breath, her tiny hands curled near her chin, innocent, serene, secure. This was her world now, not some fantasy, not a novel with a knight in shining armor who saved the day. This was better. It was authentic, a story of a woman who saved herself, whose grandmother's wisdom became her fortress, who discovered a resilience she never imagined, who cultivated something vibrant from the ruins of something broken. Elara dimmed the nursery lights and walked down the long hall to her own room. She stopped by the panoramic window, looking out over the vineyard rows bathed in moonlight. The irrigation pond shimmered, and the old sycamore trees stood like ancient sentinels, their limbs stretching for the stars somewhere out there in a sterile high-rise apartment overlooking the San Francisco Bay. Julian Croft was likely staring at city lights, haunted by the life he had demolished. But Elara did not dwell on Julian. She had not truly thought about him for a long time. He was now exactly what her business mentor had once called a footnote in a ledger she had already balanced. She felt no need to revisit the entry. She knew the final calculation and had moved on to more profitable ventures. Elara slipped into bed, pulling the quilt up to her chin. She reached for the nightstand and picked up a small, worn, leather-bound journal she kept there. It contained her grandmother Eleanor's handwriting notes on soil pH grape varietals and life lessons scribbled in the margins. It was the most unassuming object in the house, and it was Elara's most priceless asset. "Thank you," Nana Elara whispered to the memory of the woman. "Thank you for it all. I hope I'm making you proud." She placed the journal back on the nightstand, clicked off the lamp, and let her eyes drift shut outside. A soft breeze rustled through the vineyard's mature vines, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called out. Elara Vance slept soundly. Her daughter slept soundly in the adjoining room. They were secure, they were cherished, they were unbound, and that, my friends, is where we leave their story. Remember this: your worth is not a stock that can be devalued by someone else's exit. Your value is not a commodity priced by another's inability to appreciate it. Sometimes the people who walk away are unknowingly forfeiting their own greatest fortune. Sometimes being overlooked is the ultimate advantage because it gives you the space to build an empire without scrutiny. And sometimes the most profound victory isn't about retribution at all. It is about becoming so fulfilled, so prosperous, so deeply content that the person who wronged you fades into a forgotten line item in your past. Thank you for listening. If this story resonated with you, please give this video a thumbs up. Subscribe for more content and share it with someone who might need this reminder. Today, let us know in the comments what you would have done in Alara's position. We're always interested in your perspective. Until our next story, stay well and never forget. You are more capable than you know. This narrative was thoughtfully researched, crafted, and manually polished by our creative team to bring you inspiring stories and practical life wisdom. Thank you for being a valued member of our community.